Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to launch and showcase AIDR's new Community Engagement for Disaster Resilience Handbook. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my great pleasure to host this Handbook Showcase event today, which is part of Day 3 of the AIDR Knowledge Week program, Communities Creating Change. And I'm hoping that everyone has made it to this online platform from our previous Zoom session. Many of you online will know that my background is in community engagement, and I think it is one of the most critical components of emergency management and disaster resilience. So this work to produce this handbook has been something of a labour of love for all of the AIDR team. We have just published this, and it is going to be available now online, and I'll be asking the AIDR team, have put the slide up with the link to where you can find the handbook. This is actually the Community Engagement for Disaster Resilience Handbook, is our latest published handbook offering in the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. As I said, it's my firm view that community engagement is a critical component of emergency management and action to reduce disaster risk and strengthen resilience. And those of you who were with us for the previous sessions saw three fantastic examples of how the community can be best engaged in making decisions about its own risk and its own preparedness measures and its own recovery. We know, though, that disaster resilience cannot be developed for or on behalf of our communities, but relies on the sharing of information, understanding and decision-making, responsibility and resourcing within and between communities and partners. This new handbook focuses on an inclusive, strength-based approach to community engagement and its role in supporting disaster resilience. Today, we have three guest speakers who will unpack the national principles and guidance presented in the handbook. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today. Here in Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today you will see our presenters as well as their slides on the screen. You will be muted for the duration of the webinar. A significant component of this webinar is dedicated to Q&A, and we ask that you please use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and we will address these following our speakers' presentations. Please also feel free to use the chat function for general comments, and please make sure that you select all panellists and attendees in the chat window so that everyone can view your messages during the webinar. We've had more than 500 people registered to participate in this webinar today, so we do ask for your patience if there are any issues, and please note that we will be uploading this webinar to the Knowledge Hub for you to view again later. We are very fortunate to have three speakers presenting on this webinar today. Dr. Margaret Moreton, Principal at Leva Consultant and the writer of our handbook, Peter Middleton, Coordinator Community Development with Tasmanian Fire Service, and Alana Peddler, State Operations Coordinator for the Australian Red Cross Emergency Services Program. We are very grateful to have them here with us today and would like to acknowledge the significant role they all played in the development of this handbook. But before we get started, we would like to engage you by running a bit of a poll. So we'll start by getting a quick sense of who's joining us on the webinar today, and then we'll get started. So when it comes to community engagement, I'm fairly new, keen to learn more. I have some experience or knowledge. I have quite a lot of experience and knowledge. I'm mainly here because it sounded relevant and interesting. So we'll give you just a few moments to choose your response to the poll. Well, it would seem that we have some very experienced practitioners with us, with nearly half of you having quite a lot of experience and knowledge. That's great to see. And another good percentage of people having some experience and knowledge. We hope that this handbook will be a tool for you as you go about working with your communities and that you will share it with others who are also in your networks and working with communities. First of all, though, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Margaret Moreton. Margaret Moreton works with communities to identify, understand and strengthen their assets, prepare for all hazards and strengthen resilience and recovery from disasters and emergencies. She advises and works with all levels of government and with non-government organisations, including philanthropic foundations. She advocates for the resilience of communities and the importance of community agency and voice. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Amanda. I too would actually like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm sitting on. I live and work in Wadawurrung country, and we are part of the Wathaurong Nation, which is one of the nations in the Kulin Nation. For those of you who aren't aware, there are 5 nations that make up the Kulin Nation. So I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'm grateful for their continuing connection to country and to community. I also want to thank, before we go too far into the session, I would like to thank a number of people. I'll keep it brief because I know this is the boring bit. I, like you, am busting to share with you the handbook. But I would like to thank the working group. A number of people are on the working group. They're listed inside the handbook. And these people have given extensive time and expertise to the development of the handbook. And as the writer, I'm very grateful. I'm sure they'll smile if I say there were moments when I thought I would drown under their feedback. Developing a handbook is a courageous activity, and at times it's an enormous amount of information, but we worked through it together and I hope you like the result. I also want to thank the AIDR team, particularly Ella and Caitlin, who again gave lots and lots of time and effort to making this handbook the quality that it is. So the purpose of the handbook is largely to bring community engagement advice and guidance further along its path. So a number of speakers in this excellent Knowledge Week, I've really enjoyed it, have talked about community engagement and how community engagement has changed and moved. And we wanted to reflect that in the handbook. There are a number of ways that we've focused on doing so. One is to try to meet the needs of the very experienced community engagement community present today, but also those of you who indicated you're fairly new to it. We wanted to meet your needs as well, and so we hope that the handbook is quite simple and clear, and some of the images I'll show you will explain community engagement in a simple visual way. We wanted to meet the needs of communities from different places, so we hope that this handbook is as useful in rural and remote Australia as it is in urban communities or even virtual online communities. We hope it's inclusive of community members regardless of characteristics, demographics, circumstances, and we've really worked hard to make sure this handbook reflects a range of partners. Now, we use partners and partnership throughout the handbook. This language is quite intentional. There are many partners who work with communities, and this handbook is useful for all. So there are partners in business, in government and non-government, in philanthropy, and communities even partnering with one another. For those of you who saw Steve Pascoe's presentation yesterday, we have community leaders who are beginning to work with other communities, and it's fantastic. So we're hoping this handbook will be helpful for those communities as well. There are 4 key chapters in the handbook, so perhaps next slide, Andrew. The 4 key chapters are pretty much these. And briefly, I'll touch on the strategic context, which includes things like placing the handbook in the context of the Sendai framework, in the context of various national documents like the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, Australia's Vulnerability Profile, and in the broader policy landscape. I don't want to spend too much time on that, so I'm going to focus primarily on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th chapters. So next slide. Thanks, Andrew. So we spent some time clarifying what our basic principles are that underpin good community engagement, and this is what we settled on. Now, I'm not going to read them to you. Some of you may notice that we have not said community-led. That will become clear as I talk to you about the approaches in the next chapter. But community is clearly at the centre of any community engagement, and it's really important that we lift our understanding of community as the sector that does the engaging. We recognise the complexity of communities. There are many diverse identities, histories, compositions. No one community is like any other. The environment, physical, natural environment that communities are placed in varies. The reasons we connect with one another vary. The partners that work with us vary. And so we wanted these principles to reflect all of this dynamic, complex array of what makes up the places and the groups within which we live and communicate and connect. So I'm going to pass. If you've got questions about the principles, don't forget to ask them in the Q&A. Next slide. Now, this is one of my favourite parts of the handbook. There's a table in the handbook that really tries to capture pretty much on a page a whole range of options for community engagement and different approaches to community engagement. So I've just selected to show you the headline of that table, and it's all about flexibility and adaptability. So we are advocating through the handbook that different approaches can be used on different occasions. So it all depends on the context, the history, the purpose of your engagement, the timing of your engagement. And so we're not advocating that one particular approach should be used at all times. We want flexibility and adaptability to meet the needs of the community and of the partners. So just quickly, if you look at the icons, the basic approaches are that there are times when partners design and deliver a particular community engagement process, and the table unpacks what that might look like and the occasions on which it might be used, what methods it might involve. But we're advocating that that's quite acceptable. There are circumstances in which a partner will come in and deliver an idea to a community, and that's what the community would prefer. Then we have partners leading an engagement but with community input. We have communities and partners working together. We have communities leading with input from the partner, and increasingly we have communities designing and delivering and leading their own engagement processes. Now, I was realising this morning that I don't often utter the next sentence. I lean toward the right. I don't think I've ever said that before in my life. I do confess I lean toward the right, and I think many of us on the working group and involved in this handbook would say we lean toward the right. But I would like to say that it's important that all of these are applicable in different circumstances. So again, throw me questions or throw the panel questions if you'd like to have a discussion about that. I'm sure some of you are already trying to find the handbook to have a look at the rest of the table. Next slide. Another part of the handbook I love is this diagram. It's much neater than it was first envisaged, but it's very difficult to do utter chaos on a page without being overwhelming and confusing. So this slide attempts to capture the process of community engagement, and again, it's in the handbook. You'll see that it's sort of sequential. Each of these circles does flow from the one before it, but it is deliberately not linear, and we deliberately do not talk, as the previous speakers at the conference were mentioning, we deliberately do not talk of phases, stages, steps. This process is organic. It can go round and round. If any of you, as the last two speakers actually did describe, have been involved in community engagement projects, you'll know that things don't go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. They sometimes go from 4 to 3 to 2 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 2 to 4. And you go round and round. And it depends on the circumstances. So we wanted to reflect that. The basic stages of an engagement process are here. I'm not going to read them to you. You're all looking at the slide. But we wanted to reflect through the arrows that this can iterate backwards and forwards. The idea, however, is that through a context of disaster risk reduction, through a context of understanding the community, most community engagement processes will go through these various elements. And I think I'll leave it there. Next slide, please. Now, we wanted to emphasise the importance of evaluation, and even though evaluation is chapter 4, we had quite a discussion about how to build planning for evaluation in from the very beginning. And so you will see throughout the handbook, I hope, that planning for evaluation is extremely important. If we don't know what it is that we're going to measure and how it is that we're going to judge success of any engagement process, then it's more difficult to do so at the end. So we've got a whole chapter on how to plan for evaluation. We talk about program logic. We talk about identifying performance indicators and a commitment to ongoing learning. And as you will see, I've mentioned the evidence base. It's really important. I was at Dransome this morning, as many of you would have been, really important to continue to build and share the examples of where and how this works so that we can all learn from one another. There are important references listed in the handbook, and there are important and we hope very useful examples and case studies of different approaches and different styles in different circumstances. So I think I'm actually going to leave it there, and we'll hear from 2 people in a moment about different case studies. But I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to a conversation at the end of this session. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Margaret. We'll be going straight to some questions at the end, where we'll have a facilitated Q&A session with all our panellists. So I'll go straight away now to our second speaker, Peter Middleton. Peter Middleton is the Coordinator of Community Development at the Tasmanian Fire Service. Peter has a passion for evidence-based community engagement in emergency management and coordinates a team of community engagement specialists who develop community capacity to prevent, prepare for and respond to bushfires and fires in the home, including the multi-award-winning Bushfire Ready Neighbourhoods program, which increases shared responsibility and has a vision that we all play a part, individuals, agencies and communities. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and it's great to be here today for the launch of the handbook. So you'll see in my first slide there today that I've got the wording engagement in a busy and uncertain world. And I'd actually used this phrase prior to COVID-19, but I think it's more important now than ever. So today I'm going to be talking about the Bushfire Ready Neighbourhoods program that Tasmania Fire Service facilitates with the community. But I'm also going to highlight some things from the handbook that have resonated with our program and affirmed the work that we do and will guide our practice into the future. Next slide, please, Andy. So working with communities, engaging with communities, with individuals, with organisations, we all know that it's incredibly complex, incredibly changeable and diverse. I'd describe it certainly as a wicked problem. For us within the bushfire space, this image on the screen from the Dunalley bushfires in 2013 is certainly a reason as to why we work with communities to try and affect behavioural change. The scribble, as I describe it, in the bottom right-hand corner, is one way that you could look at these wicked problems or community engagement. The scribble might sometimes be at the end of this line. It might be the whole line. It might be a much smaller part of the line. But it is showing us that it's complex. So some things in the handbook that have resonated with us are the principles for community engagement on page 11. With those principles, 2 in particular that relate to this slide: recognising complexity. So I think we should never underestimate this statement and never try to second guess communities or try to perceive that it might go in this direction, because I've certainly been surprised and continue to be surprised in the time I've been involved in this program. Recognising and building capacity, is another one. And with that one, it's very much about for us, it's about trying to build sustainability with communities and that shared responsibility approach to disaster resilience. So creating shared ownership and that we all play a part with disaster resilience. Next slide, please, Andy. So specifically in terms of community engagement, we take a community development approach. And by this I mean that we recognise that working with communities is not about a one-size-fits-all approach. And what may work with one community may be very different to another. And I think we all need to be aware of this. Next slide, please, Andy. Margaret mentioned chapter 4 in the handbook about evaluation, and this has been critical to the success of our program and the continual changes, the improvements that we make every year. We've worked with, like many of you, we've worked with a number of research bodies from universities to the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, AFAC, IAP2 and many others. And really the research and the community input has been what's guided our success and our strategy with the direction we take. This can be found on page 22 of the handbook, and really I'd encourage you to be planning for this at the early stages of whatever community engagement is that you're launching into. Next slide, please, Andy. So the Bushfire Ready Neighbourhoods program, it's a program that has been running for 9 years since its pilot stages and has now launched into just recently into round 4 of the program. We don't work with all Tasmanian communities. We work with a selected number of communities. So for round 4, we're working with 17 Tasmanian communities with 3 regional community development officers and a coordinator. With this work, we select communities by talking with communities. We look at bushfire risk, we ground truth, we get out there and listen. But ultimately, it may not be the right time to work with a community, or the community may not be interested in this bushfire resilient space. So we don't just assume, or we don't just jump into it because we think it might be a good idea. We listen to the community. So it's about building social capital and trust wherever possible. Next slide, please, Andy. So in practice, what does this look like? Margaret talked about the process of community engagement on page 18 with the 6 steps. And I think I do really attest to what Margaret said, in that things can be very circular and go back and forth, and you think you've gone forward and then you go backwards and then you go round again. But there is, I think those critical 5 steps from understanding the community through to reviewing and evaluating do sum up some of the critical steps that you need to be thinking about in the community engagement journey. Next slide, please, Andy. So that's the Bushfire Ready Neighbourhoods program. I think I'd like to commend the handbook to you, and there's been a lot of expertise go into this booklet. It's there for you and your practice, and it's certainly something that will continue to drive our practice into the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'd now like to introduce our third and final speaker, Alana Peddler. Alana is the State Operations Coordinator for the Australian Red Cross Emergency Services Program. She has 10 years of experience in emergency and disaster response and recovery within Australia, supporting communities impacted by cyclones, severe flooding, bushfires and heat waves and other traumatic events impacting the community. Alana has managed several emergency preparedness projects with a strong focus on collaboration and co-design, supporting and building resilience to extreme weather and natural hazards with members of the community at a higher risk, such as people experiencing homelessness and those from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. And just a reminder to keep those questions going into the Q&A so we can have a discussion with the panellists after Alana's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today to launch this exciting new handbook. It's been a privilege to participate in the development of the handbook and working across Australia with some really diverse experts. So it's been a really challenging and really fun experience for me. I guess what's resonated the most with this handbook is its adaptability. It's being able to provide lots of examples and guidance on some different community engagement approaches and the best way to take them on when you're working with some really diverse communities. A key with me would be for the importance to recognise how community engagement is a foundation for disaster resilience work. It's how we engage with the communities, it's how we communicate and place them at the centre of our work that's really vital for how successful we can be. And to do with, for my recent work, I was just looking at how really effective community engagement is inclusive, and it's how we work with the complexity and diversity of the communities, which leads me to my case study, which is in the handbook. So it's called Out of the Storm. It was a collaboration with the Australian Red Cross, Central Queensland University and the Hutt Street Centre, which is a homeless service provider here in Adelaide. So we're looking at how we could build extreme weather resilience with the community. Next slide, please, Andy. So yeah, just go over some 3 key principles for how this project unfolded. We've created a really safe space where we could have some really open dialogue and conversations with people experiencing homelessness. So we held a number of workshops at Hutt Street Centre and just encourage people to just share their ideas and their experiences of living through extreme weather events, whether it's heat waves or extreme cold and storms, and what happens when they're outside during some of those events, and inviting in other key experts, so people from the SES or SA Police or the SA Ambulance, and everyone just sharing their experiences and their knowledge. And we drew that information through a collaborative design and delivery approach where we were able to create some preparedness materials, building from those conversations and drawing on the really expertise from those communities, because they really have some unique knowledge and skills that they've developed over years of sleeping rough. And we led into some peer-led outreach. This is when people who participated in the workshops and the design part of the workshops were then employed and trained and supported to go out to the community and to share those messages and some of the preparedness kits that we created. So the picture you can see is one of our peer outreach workers out delivering some of the preparedness kits to someone in the parklands in Adelaide. Next slide, please, Andy. So just drawing further on some of those key principles, what was really successful in this project is just that we recognised that to engage the community expertise, it wasn't just limited to what the emergency management brought. It was looking at how people express, how people experience homelessness and some of those unique environments that they've lived through and their skills and their resilience that they've built up over years, and drawing on that knowledge to create something really unique and relevant and tailored for the particular community that we're working with. Next slide. From that process, we were able to design in collaboration with the group some preparedness information, so just doing with extreme heat and extreme cold and storm. So we did a summer version and a winter version, and we drew information from all of the service providers that were included, as well as the homeless community. I'll show you some of the resources in the next slide, but we also created what we called preparedness kits. So they were these little bags that had tailored bags that had information and resources for people to hang on to during extreme weather events. So for example, the winter bags had a hot water bottle and a beanie and some other wet weather gear and some information to help keep them safe during extreme weather events. And the summer one likewise had a water bottle, hat, sunscreen, insect repellent, etc. And we also be able to create a practice guide, which is what the image is there, which we've used as a replicable guide for the last 12 months working in regional parts of South Australia. So I've been engaging with different service providers, again, homeless service providers in 6 different regions of South Australia, and replicating this model again with those service providers. Next slide, please. So this is some of the resources that we were able to create with the homeless service providers and the homeless people who experience homelessness and the other emergency management agencies. So there were some top tips during summer and winter, and now everything on these posters and this map were designed with participants in the workshop, down to the logo for the Out of the Storm project, the colour, the language, the images, everything was designed with the group. What we focused on a lot was how people keep informed and how people keep up to date. So we went through a whole lot of different ways people could communicate or receive information about weather warnings and where else they could find some really relevant information for themselves. What was really successful as a resource was on the right it's a city guide map. So you take the premise of a city guide map, but you just put anything that is relevant to someone sleeping rough. So the guys fed lots of information about where they could get free showers, free meals, where the homeless service providers were, but they also then communicated all this information about where it's best to sleep during extreme weather events. So what you can see on those little maps is the little blue stripy lines. That's actually flood-prone areas in the parklands around Adelaide. So that information was fed from both the SES and people experiencing homelessness to say that's not where you want to sleep during the extreme weather event. Likewise, where there's some safe places to stay during a heat wave. The maps fold up into your pocket size and they are tear-proof and water resistant. So as I was told by a couple of guys during this workshop, you had to create a resource that was just as tough as they were. And I challenged my guys quite often to see if they could tear one of these maps, and so far they haven't been able to tear one yet. That's how tough they are. Next slide, please. So we've finished with peer-led weather outreach. So we trained up some people who used to use the service at the homeless centre in Hutt Street, and we trained them to do outreach, and we supported them to go and do outreach. So they went out and shared the kits and the information, the key messaging. So there's an image of two of the outreach guys walking the parklands and handing out some kits and some of the maps. And next slide, thanks. So I just want to leave you with this image. So last February in Adelaide, we had our hottest day on record. It was about 47 degrees in the CBD. And I went out with a temperature gun just to take some images of some of the areas that we know people sleep or spend their days, usually if they're sleeping rough, in the CBD. This park bench is in Whitmore Square in Adelaide CBD, which is quite a place where there's lots of people who are sleeping rough quite often sleep on these park benches or nearby. So I just wanted to leave you with this image of how hot it can really get in South Australia during a heat wave, and imagine what it's like if you're sleeping outside during one of these weather events. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alana. And thank you to all our speakers, to Margaret, to Peter and to Alana. Shortly it will be your turn to have some of your questions answered. But before we do that, and in the spirit of inclusive community engagement, it's your turn to get involved. I'd now like to invite all of our webinar participants to take part in a chat bomb. We have something like 172 people online now, so this should be a bit of fun. You need to follow the instructions. So what I'd like you to do is to use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, so the chat, not the Q&A at this point. And I'd like you to add an answer to a question I'm about to give you, but don't press enter. So you have to wait until I say go before you press enter. So the question I'm going to ask you is, what is the first question that comes to mind when you think about the challenges and opportunities for community engagement or disaster resilience? So please start putting that answer into the chat function. I'll give you a few minutes. Don't press enter. So the question, I'll say it again, what is the first question that comes to mind when you think about the challenges and opportunities for community engagement for disaster resilience? We'll give you about 30 seconds, so we're on the countdown now. Please don't press enter yet. We're going to all press enter at the same time. Keep answering that question. The first challenge that comes to mind when you think about challenges and opportunities for community engagement for disaster resilience. Now, either no one has jumped the gun, so either everyone is paying attention or no one has answered my question. Oh, someone has jumped the gun and pressed and so has someone else. So we're going to go through the countdown now. So I want you to press enter in 3, 2, 1, press enter. So we've got 80 odd responses. You can read them for yourself, but there's some really interesting things coming through. Who leads cultural change? How do we take stakeholders in one direction? Who are the right stakeholders we need to engage with? COVID-19. A few people saying COVID-19 is the greatest challenge we face. Government red tape. So lots of interesting answers. Well, thank you for participating in that. We will be saving all these chat of a chat function. So now I'd like to bring back all the panellists, if I might. And we'll move into the Q&A session. So there's some great things coming through on that chat. I hope you had a chance to have a look at them. We've heard a lot about this today, and I'm happy for anyone to answer this question. We've heard a lot today that one size does not fit all when you're working with the community, and it seems to be widely recognised and accepted. Why then is it so difficult to convince governments of this when they are developing their response, and what can be done to ensure in future that disaster response adheres to this principle? I might go to you, Margaret.
Thanks. Oh, that's such a good question, and I would really like to have a whole presentation just on that question. I think the short version is that large organisations that work for governments have particular requirements, accountability requirements, how they function, how they're structured, and I'd like to think it doesn't have to be this way, but almost inevitably structure and rigidity comes into that, and accountability drives risk-averse behaviour. I really wish I had longer to explain this. I've spent 30 years working in government, for people who don't know me, before I jumped ship and began working in this field. Many great people work in government, and you know, I'm concerned for them about what I'm about to say. I too find government rigid. I think what we have to do is continue to lobby, all of us in our different roles, for change and for flexibility. That's my short answer.
Thanks, Margaret. I'll go to another question. I think it's really relevant for you, Alana, given the nature of the people you're working with. So do you have any thoughts on the importance of a mandate for engagement and prior commitment on behalf of decision makers that they will respond authentically to the outcomes of engagement? So I think it's the mandate to work with the homeless community as you did, and also the mandate for the decision makers that they would do anything in response to what you were uncovering through that engagement.
Yeah, I mean, it would make my project go a lot smoother, that's for sure. But I was lucky with the local government and local police and all the agencies that they really wanted to be engaged in this project. Everyone found it really both fascinating and challenging, and they saw that the importance of the workshops and the project and the success of being able to engage with the community that, you know, it's been ignored a lot of the time. It's just one of those invisible communities that they haven't really been included in any conversations about how we respond to them during any kind of emergencies, or just in general how we engage with them. I think how we've responded during COVID especially has probably highlighted that it can be done. They did have, I don't know if they did it in every state, but they did do in South Australia that they provided some hotel accommodation to get people off the streets and sleeping rough during when COVID first started with in Adelaide, just to try and get people to be able to actually adhere to some of the COVID restrictions because they didn't have anywhere to stay. So they did prove that it could be done when there was enough motivation behind it. So it's an interesting space to be in, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we can push for and what we can show some really good evidence for in the near future.
Thanks, Alana. There's a question that's just more, I suppose, functional in nature about, you know, updating the handbook to make sure that it's, you know, relevant going forward. And I'm probably best to answer that. So we have a 5-year rolling program of updating and reviewing all our handbooks at AIDR. But if there is a new piece of research and or there's been a major fire or other emergency incident and there's a post-incident analysis or some key learning, we will do an update within that 5-year period so that we can consume that, you know, latest thinking and knowledge into the handbook. So they are constantly being reviewed. The other thing, we produce are companion guides. So sometimes we can just, you know, include an updated companion guide. Peter, I might go to you because you spoke about, you know, the fact that you don't work with all communities, and I think that is a real challenge. How do you prioritise all the possible groups and communities we could involve?
Yeah, really, really good question, Amanda. And for us, it's about wanting to work with communities effectively. And I guess we can't be everything to everyone. And so when we commenced the actual rollout of the program in 2014, we developed a set of 8 criteria with how we identify the communities that we're going to work with. So those criteria consist of some of those things I mentioned in my presentation, like bushfire risk. Is the community ready for this? How connected is the community? Are they on one-way in, one-way out roads, for example? So we look at that and we start with lists of like 800 communities that are at risk to bushfire in Tasmania and drill down through these criteria and get significant community input and stakeholder input as well. But we're constantly approached by others. I had phone calls today. Can we come and support this community down in the Huon Valley? And where we have capacity, we certainly will try to support those, but we do make it very clear that we work with a set or a general set number of communities so that we can try to have impact with those communities.
Thanks, Peter. And look, I will just reference the newly released work of the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC with regard to the Australian Disaster Resilience Index, because that can be used as a tool as well to determine, where you might want to put your efforts in terms of which programs and how you're going to prioritise effort and resources and so on. There's a question that I think is very topical at the moment, and it's to do with how do we, in a time of COVID such as now, when we've always been so reliant on face-to-face community engagement activities, how are we going to still continue to engage the community in what will be a difficult lead into this summer and, the typical get-ready season? They're asking if it's been considered in the handbook, and I might say that the handbook has taken nearly 12 months to develop. And so when we started on this journey, Margaret, and with the working group, COVID wasn't a thing. So I might go to you first, Margaret, to answer that question, and then that broader consideration about engagement in COVID times.
Yep, thank you. And that's a really good question. In a way, it relates to one of the previous questions about how often is this reviewed. I dare anyone to predict what the next 4 months brings because we don't know. So in the approaches, so back to table 1 in the document, in the approaches, we've made sure that we've included online approaches, approaches that can be used while physically distancing. So we've done our best to make sure that we've included ways that we can engage with one another and work together even in a COVID environment. Having said that, there's an awful lot going on and we're learning very quickly. I'm personally currently working in 3 communities that have a particular consultative community engagement component. And for those of you who don't know me, you can see that I have grey hair. I had grey hair before COVID. I am using online platforms that I've never heard of before in order to run consultation processes where everyone's in their own home. So we are learning quickly and new programs are coming out. So we've used a generic term called online in the handbook, when actually in the next couple of months there'll probably be 20 of those when there wasn't at the beginning of COVID. So it's an emerging field, really.
Thanks, Margaret. And I think we're all learning to adapt to the new world, hence this Australian Disaster Resilience Conference Knowledge Week online. Alana, I might go to you, given your background with the Red Cross. What is the interplay between psychosocial preparedness and resilience in the context of drought, issues in rural and regional Australia, as opposed to that sort of more rapid onset disaster that we see with, bushfires, floods, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I've been fortunate that we have some drought resilience officers in South Australia that we and our team in emergency services. So we do see a really good crossover from how we provide our psychological first aid and our psychological support in general as an emergency services core business, and now how we incorporate that and how we build resilience and have those discussions in our drought impacted communities. So we're fortunate that some of our drought officers have been running a lot of workshops where they draw a lot of skills and knowledge from our core business, from our psychological preparedness and our psychological first aid messaging, and how they interplay that with working with our farmers and our communities in those rural areas that have been impacted for, you know, a number of years now. Some people have been going through this cycle for so long now that they trying to work out how you have those conversations with farmers about psychological first aid is very different to how you would have a conversation with someone who's just gone through a cyclone or a fire, when that impact has just hit them really quite suddenly, as opposed to recognizing the slow onset of some of those impacts when it's been over a generation, or at least, you know, a number of years, decades even, with some parts of our state where we've been in and out of official drought and unofficial drought, depending on how you look at it. So yeah, there is definitely a crossover, and we've really been able to, it's been really interesting to see that from the emergency services side, having the drought part of our program now, so we can draw from each other about how we engage with our community. So it's a really interesting space to be in.
Thanks, Alana. I might also just make mention of the fact that all our handbooks are supported by companion documents, knowledge into action briefs, and so on. So go to the AIDR Knowledge Hub where this handbook is located, and there are, I think, 3 companion guides to support the implementation of this handbook, and there will also be more as time goes on. So please check out those resources. I'm not sure who would like to answer this question, but there is a lot of discussion in emergency management around shared responsibility, but little about how this looks at the local level, or that shared does not necessarily mean equal. How are the speakers referencing shared responsibility in their work? So I might go to you first, Peter, because you're doing that sort of in action with the program you're leading.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. That it's not necessarily an equal partnership. It may be more heavily weighted that the community has more ownership, or the fire service, or the Red Cross, or rural property owners. But I think it is critical to identify that, yeah, it's not, I wouldn't say, I'd say it's rarely an equal partnership. It varies depending on the slants, but from our perspective and a program perspective, we certainly aim towards having as much equal partnership as possible. But I think just through that engagement and community development work, it unfolds in different ways.
Thanks, Peter. Would anyone else like to tackle the shared responsibility? Oh, Margaret, you're...
I'm busting. Because I also want to link it to one of the comments and questions in the chat from Sue up in far north Queensland. So I was working in government when shared responsibility was first used in a welfare reform sense. And so it gives me a sort of a traumatic stress reaction. Because it was code for the poor and socially disadvantaged can carry more of the weight. That's my opinion, not Ada's opinion. So shared responsibility for me has all sorts of complications to it. There is a different power dynamic in almost every community engagement project. And someone will come with more resources or money or time. Others will come completely voluntary, doing it out of their hours while juggling their families and children. So there's a lot of elements of shared responsibility. It's not straightforward. And the reference to Sue's question is, she quite rightly points out that online engagement has an inbuilt imbalance as well. I'm currently working in the Bega Valley Shire, and there are places in the Bega Valley Shire, heaven forbid, that have absolutely no internet connection. None. Zip. I've had people driving 15, 20 Ks in order to talk to me from their car. So the whole shared responsibility notion requires a bit of attention and, again, advocacy from some of us who like to bother people, to equalise a little. You know, the homeless group, the disadvantaged group. It's all very well to say let's have shared responsibility, but we need to do something about equalising our ability to participate.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Margaret. Certainly that whole issue of reaching the hard to reach who's not at the table, that's a critical part of engagement. I think we could all talk all day on this topic, given how connected we are to this subject, but I would like to put one last question out there around monitoring and evaluation, because I think it is such a critical part that we evaluate our practice. And the question is, what would be your best advice on how to keep the evaluation aspects tangible, measurable, and with all the intangible complexities of community engagement? I might ask you, Alana, given the work you've done there with the homeless groups.
Yes, that was certainly a challenge with my project with working in the homelessness sector, is actually being able to have a really, has to be a really adaptable way of actually engaging with the participants and getting some feedback about how things are actually travelling. I halfway through the project realised I needed to have a client reference group just to even work through some of the M&E stuff with them about what's actually more appropriate, what's going to work with that, with people experiencing homelessness. So it had to work some stuff out along the way just with that cohort, because we haven't done a project like this before, and there wasn't a guide about how to engage with the homeless community about a particular topic like this in this way before. It was really challenging just to work out, well, what's actually going to work. And sometimes it was a little bit trial and error, more than we would usually do with some of our other more established projects with communities that we've engaged with more regularly, or have access to some of the resources. It's what Margaret just referred to about shared responsibility, is having shared access to the resources. So we can't ask a community to be able to engage in a certain way if they don't even have access to the internet, a phone, a computer, or the ability to come in on a regular occasion to participate in some engagement processes. So yeah, it certainly was a challenge just to be as adaptable as possible and engage with the community about what actually works for them and help them guide how we can develop a framework for evaluation and monitoring as we went. So I've kind of learnt more from the first pilot project that I'm being able to try and implement for the second project, just because it was just a unique environment to be in.
Thanks very much, Alana. And I can also say from our experience working in AIDR, we're building a monitoring and evaluation framework ourselves. And the advice has been to keep it simple and also to be able to do the data collection within the resources you have. So I think that they're two pretty fundamental principles. And also to think about, you know, how you're going to use those measures to both learn, you know, within yourself about how the program's going, but also to be a learning organisation and to continually, you know, review your practice and make sure that what you're doing is actually, you know, contributing to the outcomes you seek to achieve. So they're just some of the tips we've been given, and I think they apply equally to community engagement. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap it up now because, as I said, we could talk for probably till 6 o'clock on this topic. But on behalf of everyone who's attended today, and we did peak at, I think, around 180 participants, I would like to thank all of our 3 speakers for showcasing the new handbook and sharing their knowledge, experience and time. So thank you very much. The next handbook that AIDR will be showcasing is the Emergency Planning Handbook. We will host a webinar to launch and showcase that handbook sometime in September, and we will circulate the details for that webinar shortly. Thank you very much for attending the sessions today. We will be sending you a link of a recording for today's webinar for those who are unable to attend. And I'd also encourage you to explore the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection on the Knowledge Hub, which is where the webinar recording will be hosted alongside a suite of other resources. Thank you very much and good afternoon.